let me make a comparison to show my point. Let's compare religious belief with political ideology. After all, religion is not the only belief that's armored against criticism. You know, a lot of beliefs are armored against criticism. We're very good at armoring our beliefs against criticism. That's how the human mind works. It's not the only belief that leads people to ignore evidence in favor of their settled opinion. In fact, we do that a lot of the time. It's human nature. And contrary to the popular atheist saying, religion is not the only belief that can inspire good people to do evil things. Political ideology can do all of that quite nicely. You know, people committed horrors to perpetuate Stalinism and communism, which was an ideology that many of these people sincerely believed was best. And horrors were committed by Americans in the last Bush administration in the name of democracy and freedom. But even the most stubborn political ideology will eventually crumble in the face of it, you know, not working. You know, people can only be told for so long that under communism everybody will eat strawberries and cream, and that in an unrestricted free market the rising tide will lift all boats. You know, a political ideology makes promises about this life, about this world. You know, if the strawberries and the cream and the rising boats aren't forthcoming, people are eventually going to notice. You know, the 2008 election was a really good example of that, as in fact are the recent labor uprisings in Wisconsin and around the country. People can rationalize a political ideology for a very long time, but ultimately the proof is in the pudding. Religion is different. With religion, the proof is emphatically not in the pudding. With religion, the proof comes from invisible beings and inaudible voices. The proof comes from prophets and religious leaders who supposedly hear these inaudible voices and are perfectly happy to tell the rest of them what they said. They come from religious texts written ages ago by prophets and religious leaders, ditto. It comes from feelings in people's hearts. You know, always, I just feel it in my heart. You know, the feelings that conveniently tell people what they most strongly want to believe or what they already believe. And the proof comes in the afterlife, after people die and can't come back to tell us about it. So with religion, even if God's rules and promises aren't working out, followers still follow them, because the ultimate judge and judgment are invisible. There's no pudding, there's no proof, and there's no expectation that there should even be any. And there's therefore no reality check when religion starts to go to the bad place. In fact, with many religions, this idea that you should expect to eat the pudding, this idea that you should expect evidence to support the ideas that you hold, is blasphemy. And a major part of many religious doctrines is that trusting your faith without evidence is not only acceptable, but a positive virtue, something that you should aspire to. John 20:29, have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. Followed by John 20:30, give me money and let me have sex with your wife. And this idea isn't limited to fundamentalists. It's very common among moderate and progressive believers as well. Moderate and progressive believers love to talk about how wonderful it is to think with your heart and not with your head, and how an excessive concern with reason and evidence closes you off to the grander truths of life, etc. You know, this idea that it's valid and even virtuous to believe in things we have no good reason to think are true, this is one of the cores of religious belief, and not just the freaky extremist versions of it. All of it. So in other words, the belief in invisible beings, undetectable forces, and events that happen after we die provides a uniquely effective armor against the valid criticism, questioning, and deflation of ideas and institutions that do serious harm. And religion builds on this armor with layer after layer. You know, what David Silverman was talking about, how today religion is weak, but it has all these insulating layers of armor. I sometimes say that religion is like a house of cards built inside a fortress. And among these insulating layers are the idea that letting go of religious doubts is a liberating act of love. The idea that skepticism and questioning are the same thing as cynicism, nihilism, and despair. The idea that religion operates in a different realm from the everyday world, and it's not fair to hold it to normal standards of evidence. The idea that criticizing religion is inherently rude and intolerant. The idea that criticizing religion is a mortal sin that will get you burning in hell for all eternity. When coupled with the fact that the core belief is, by definition, unverifiable, these layers armor religion even more effectively against valid questions, thus, once again, undermining our ability to see when it's become absurd, implausible, or grotesquely immoral, or all three. I could give oodles of examples of how exactly this plays out, but we have limited time here, so I want to talk about just one example of, a specific example of how this plays out. I want to talk about how the unverifiability of religion makes religion uniquely capable of justifying bigotry. Clearly, human beings do not need religious justification for bigotry. We're perfectly capable of being bigots all on our own. But as powerful as bigotry is, it ultimately has a natural, if painfully and depressingly slow, reality check. You know, when people see that in reality, not all women are ditzy idiots, and not all black people are lazy criminals, and not all gay people are miserable and crazy, eventually, over years and decades, they can change their minds. And if they don't, their kids do. One of the single most predictive factor in whether people support gay rights is how young they are. Bigotry is strong, but reality plus time is stronger. But when bigotry is justified by religion, this reality check gets shot in the foot. When bigotry is justified by the inaudible voice of God and the very audible voices of people who claim to speak for God, the reality check saying that bigotry is wrong easily gets drowned out. Again, because the voice of God is inaudible and the proof of the pudding is in the afterlife where nobody can see it. And if it's God who's telling you that blacks were condemned by God to serve whites, or that women were designed by God to defer to men, or that homosexuals have abandoned morality and have defied God's will, I mean, who are you to say that's not true? I mean, sure, you have the reality in front of you, the reality, of good gay people and independent women and brilliant black people with outstanding leadership skills. But balance that against the word of the creator of the universe, what's going to win? Especially when it's a bigotry you're already inclined to believe and one that works in your favor. When bigotry is justified by the untestable voice of religious faith, what possible chance does inconvenient reality have against it? So it drives me up a tree when people insist that religious bigotry and wars and violence and hatred and so on aren't really the fault of religion. No, of course not. It's the fault of religious leaders, greedy, selfish, power-hungry religious leaders who are manipulating the people, or it's the fault of the people. It's the fault of religious followers they're driven by their fear and their ego and their tribalism, and they don't understand the true meaning of God, whatever that might be. Or else the wars and violence or so on, they're really about something else. They're really about power or land or money or so on. I mean, obviously, religious wars and hatreds, they're complex. Of course, a lot of causes feed into them. But to deny the role that religion plays in religious conflicts is a textbook example of ignoring the elephant in the room. And it's like looking at an enormous steaming pile of elephant shit in the room and saying, my goodness, where could this elephant shit have come from? It must have been brought here by a greedy, selfish, power-hungry elephant trainer. That elephant? I don't see any elephant. I don't see where that came from. So when people say, oh, it's not fair to blame religion for the terrible things done in its name, I must passionately beg to differ. When you take a close look at the litany of religious harms that I've been ranting about, you'll find that every single one of them has as its core this basic nature of religion and the basic nature of what makes it different from other human activities. Its fundamental unverifiability and its complete lack of any sort of reality check. So I think it is entirely fair to blame religion for the harm that is done in its name. And what makes religion unique is what makes religion screwed up. And I think atheist anger about it is completely justified. But is it valid? And is it useful? Does anger about religion help or hurt our cause? I will acknowledge freely that anger is a difficult tool in a social change movement. It's even possibly a dangerous one. Anger can make people act rashly. Anger can make it hard to think clearly. It can make people treat potential allies as enemies. In the worst case scenario, it can lead to violence. The anger can misfire, and it can misfire badly, and we need to acknowledge that. And contrary to popular opinion, research pretty clearly shows that expressing anger does not make people calmer and less angry. That whole thing about, oh, you vent anger and then you're less mad, that's not true. When we express anger, we get angrier. It's one of the reasons I'm up here ranting today. So I don't, in fact, want to be cavalier about anger. I do think it's a difficult tool, and I think it's one we need to be careful with. But even with all that being said, yes, I think that anger in a social change movement is not only valid, but valuable and necessary. Why? Because anger is always necessary. Because anger has driven every major movement for social change in this country, and probably in the world. Certainly everyone that I'm aware of. I mean, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the gay rights movement, the environmental movement, every single one of them has had, as a major driving force, a tremendous amount of anger. Anger over injustice, anger over mistreatment and brutality, anger over helplessness. We need to be very clear about this distinction. Anger is not violence. Anger is not bigotry. Anger is not hatred. I don't support violence, I don't support bigotry, I don't support hatred. Anger is not those things. Anger is an emotion indicating displeasure and antagonism with a state of affairs. Anger is one of the chief ways that we know things aren't okay. Anger is how we know that people are being hurt unnecessarily, not just ourselves, but other people. Anger is how we know that there is unfairness and injustice in the world, not just done to us, but done to other people. Anger is how we know this, not just with our heads, but with our hearts. And anger is what motivates us to bloody well do something about it. Why else would people bother to mobilize social change movements? Social change movements are hard. You know, they take time, they take energy, they take money. Sometimes they take serious risk of life and limb and community and career. Nobody would bother with social change movements if they weren't really furious about something. So when people tell atheists not to be so angry, they are, in essence, telling us to disempower ourselves. They're telling us to lay down one of the single most powerful tools we have at our disposal. They're telling us to lay down a tool that no social change movement has ever been able to do without. They're telling us to be polite and diplomatic, when history clearly shows that polite diplomacy in a social change movement, while very important, works far better when it's coupled with passionate anger. And in a battle between David and Goliath, they're telling David to lay down his slingshot. And just, I don't know, gnaw Goliath on the ankles or something. That's a lot, you know, that could be fun, but it's a lot less effective than a slingshot. In fact, when believers tell atheists not to be so angry or not to be so vocal about our anger, it's difficult to escape the conclusion that this disempowerment is exactly the point. The atheist movement is doing extraordinarily well, especially for a movement that's only been seriously mobilized in a few years. Atheists have made astonishing strides in visibility in an extremely short time. We've gone from being on virtually nobody's radar to being a major topic of conversation in op-ed pages and magazine articles and, you know, at water coolers around the country in a really short period of time. Many of our books have been bestsellers. Our lobbyists have met with White House officials. We've even been openly acknowledged in positive ways by the President of the United States, something that, to my knowledge, has never before happened in the history of this country. And, very importantly, rates of religious non-belief are going up at an astonishing rate all over the country and all over the world. And that trend is especially true among young people, which is arguably the most important demographic in any social change movement. Clearly, we are doing something right. Clearly, our anger, among many other factors of course, has been extremely effective, both at drawing attention to our movement and at motivating people to get involved with it. And clearly, this has a lot of people seriously freaked out. Its capacity to do harm can spin into the stratosphere.